Chapter 3 of The World Set Free by H. G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marcetich. June 2009, Alexandria, Virginia. Chapter the Third. The Ending of War. Section 6. One single monarch held out against the general acquiescence in the new rule, and that was the strange survival of medievalism, the Slavic fox, the king of the Balkans. He debated and delayed his submissions. He showed an extraordinary combination of cunning and temerity in his evasion of the repeated summonses from Brissago. He affected ill health and a great preoccupation with his new official mistress, for his semi-barbaric court was arranged on the best romantic models. His tactics were ably seconded by Dr. Pestovitch, his chief minister. Failing to establish his claims to complete independence, King Ferdinand Charles annoyed the conference by a proposal to be treated as a protected state. Finally he professed an unconvincing submission, and put a mass of obstacles in the way of the transfer of his national officials to the new government. In these things he was enthusiastically supported by his subjects, still for the most part an illiterate peasantry, passionately if confusedly patriotic, and so far with no practical knowledge of the effect of atomic bombs. More particularly he retained control of all the Balkan aeroplanes. For once the extreme naivete of Leblanc seems to have been mitigated by duplicity. He went on with the general pacification of the world as if the Balkan submission was made in absolute good faith, but he announced the disbandment of the force of aeroplanes that hitherto guarded the council at Brissago upon the approaching 15th of July. But instead, he doubled the number upon duty on that eventful day, and made various arrangements for their disposition. He consulted certain experts, and when he took King Egbert into his confidence, there was something in his neat and explicit foresight that brought back to that ex-monarch's mind his half-forgotten fantasy of Leblanc as a fisherman under a green umbrella. About 5 o'clock in the morning of the 17th of July, one of the elder sentinels of the Brissago fleet, which was soaring unobtrusively over the lower end of the Lake of Garda, sighted and hailed a strange aeroplane that was flying westward, and, failing to get a satisfactory reply, set its wireless apparatus talking and gave chase. A swarm of consorts appeared very promptly over the westward mountains, and before the unknown airplane had sighted Como, it had a dozen eager attendants closing upon it. Its driver seems to have hesitated, dropped down among the mountains, and then turned southward in flight, only to find an intercepting biplane sweeping across his bows. Then he went round into the eye of the rising sun, and passed within 100 yards of his original pursuer. The sharpshooter therein opened fire at once, and showed an intelligent grasp of the situation by disabling the passenger first. The man at the wheel must have heard his companion cry out behind him, but he was too intent on getting away to waste even a glance behind. Twice after that he must have heard shots. He let his engine go, he crouched down, and for 20 minutes he must have steered in the continual expectation of a bullet. It never came, and when at last he glanced around, 3 planes were close upon him, and his companion, thrice hit, lay dead across the bombs. His followers manifestly did not mean either to upset or shoot him, but inexorably they drove him down, down. At last he was curving and flying 100 yards or less over the level fields of rice and maize. Ahead of him, and dark against the morning sunrise, was a village with a very tall and slender campanile and a line of cable bearing metal standards that he could not clear. He stopped his engine abruptly and dropped flat. He may have hoped to get at the bombs when he came down, but his pitiless pursuers drove right over him and shot him as he fell. 3 other aeroplanes curved down and came to rest amidst the grass close by the smashed machine. Their passengers descended and ran, holding their light rifles in their hands, towards the debris and the 2 dead men. The coffin-shaped box that had occupied the center of the machine had broken, and 3 black objects, each with 2 handles like the ears of a pitcher, lay peacefully amidst the litter. These objects were so tremendously important in the eyes of their captors, that they disregarded the 2 dead men who lay bloody and broken amidst the wreckage as they might have disregarded dead frogs by a country pathway. "By God!" cried the first, "here they are!" "And unbroken," said the second. "I've never seen the things before," said the first. "Bigger than I thought," said the second. The third comer arrived. He stared for a moment at the bombs, and then turned his eyes to the dead man with a crushed chest, who lay in a muddy place among the green stems under the center of the machine. "One can take no risks," he said, with a faint suggestion of apology. The other 2 now also turned to the victims. "We must signal," said the first man. A shadow passed between them and the sun, and they looked up to see the aeroplane that had fired the last shot. "Shall we signal?" came a megaphone hail. "3 bombs," they answered together. "Where do they come from?" asked the megaphone. The 3 sharpshooters looked at each other, and then moved towards the dead men. One of them had an idea. "Signal that first," he said, "while we look." They were joined by their aviators for the search, and all 6 men began a hunt that was necessarily brutal in its haste, for some indication of identity. They examined the men's pockets, their blood-stained clothes, the machine, the framework. They turned the bodies over and flung them aside. There was not a tattoo mark. Everything was elaborately free of any indication of its origin. "We can't find out," they called at last. "Not a sign?" "Not a sign." "I'm coming down," said the man overhead. Section 7. The Slavic fox stood upon a metal balcony in his picturesque Art Nouveau palace that gave upon the precipice that overhung his bright little capital, and beside him stood Pestovitch, grizzled and cunning, and now full of an ill-suppressed excitement. Behind them the window opened into a large room, richly decorated in aluminum and crimson and enamel, across which the king, as he glanced ever and again over his shoulder with a gesture of inquiry, could see through the 2 open doors of a little azure-walled antechamber, the wireless operator in the turret working at his incessant transcription. 2 pompously uniformed messengers waited listlessly in this apartment. The room was furnished with a stately dignity, and had in the middle of it a big green baize covered table, with the massive white metal ink pots, and antiquated sandboxes natural to a new but romantic monarchy. It was the king's council chamber, and about it now, in attitudes of suspended intrigue, stood the half-dozen ministers who constituted his cabinet. They had been summoned for 12 o'clock. but still at 12:30 the king loitered in the balcony, and seemed to be waiting for some news that did not come. The king and his minister had talked at first in whispers. They had fallen silent, for they found little now to express except a vague anxiety. Away there on the mountainside there were the white metal roofs of the long farm buildings beneath which the bomb factory and the bombs were hidden. The chemist who had made all of these for the king had died suddenly after the declaration of Brissago. Nobody knew of that store of mischief now but the king and his adviser, and 3 heavily faithful attendants, the aviators who waited now, in the midday blaze with their bomb-carrying machines and their passenger bomb-throwers in the exercising grounds of the motor-cyclist barracks below, were still in ignorance of the position of the ammunition they were presently to take up. It was time they started if the scheme was to work as Pestovitch had planned it. It was a magnificent plan. It aimed at no less than the empire of the world. The government of idealists and professors away there at Brissago was to be blown to fragments, and then east, west, north, and south those airplanes would go swarming over a world that had disarmed itself, to proclaim Ferdinand Charles, the new Caesar, the master, lord of the earth. It was a magnificent plan. But the tension of this waiting for news of the success of the first blow was considerable. The Slavic fox was full of pallid fairness. He had a remarkably long nose, a thick, short moustache, and small blue eyes that were a little too near together to be pleasant. It was his habit to worry his moustache with short, nervous tugs whenever his restless mind troubled him, and now this motion was becoming so incessant that it irked Pestovitch beyond the limits of endurance. "I will go," said the minister, "and see what the trouble is with the wireless. They will give us nothing, good or bad." Left to himself, the king could worry his moustache without stint. He leant his elbows forward on the balcony, and gave both of his long white hands to the work, so that he looked like a pale dog gnawing a bone. Suppose they caught his men, what should he do? Suppose they caught his men? The clocks on the light gold-capped belfries of the town below presently intimated the half-hour after midday. Of course, he and Pestovitch had thought it out. Even if they had caught those men, they were pledged to secrecy. Probably they would be killed in the catching. One could deny anyhow, deny and deny. And then he became aware of half a dozen little shining specks very high in the blue. Pestovitch came out to him presently. "The government messages, sire, have all dropped into cipher," he said. "I have sent a man—" "Look," interrupted the king, and pointed upward with a long lean finger. Pestovitch followed that indication, and then glanced for one questioning moment at the white face before him. "We have to face it out, sire." For some moments they watched the steep spirals of descending messengers, and then they began a hasty consultation. They decided that to be holding a council upon the details of an ultimate surrender to Brissago was an innocent-looking thing as the king could well be doing. And so, when at last the ex-King Egbert, whom the council had sent as its envoy, arrived upon the scene, he discovered the king almost theatrically posed at the head of his councillors in the midst of his court. The door upon the wireless operators was shut. The ex-king from Brissago came like a draught through the curtains, and attendants that gave a wide margin to King Ferdinand's state, and the familiar confidence of his manner belied a certain hardness in his eye. Firmin trotted behind him, and no one else was with him. And as Ferdinand Charles rose to greet him, there came into the heart of the Balkan king, again, that same chilly feeling that he had felt upon the balcony, and it passed at the careless gestures of his guest. For surely any one might outwit this foolish talker who, for a mere idea at the command of a little French rationalist in spectacles, had thrown away the most ancient crown in all the world. One must deny. And then slowly and quite tiresomely he realized that there was nothing to deny. His visitor, with an amiable ease, went on talking about everything in debate between himself and Brissago, except— Could it be that they had been delayed? Could it be that they had to drop for repairs and were still uncaptured? Could it be that even now, while this fool babbled, while they were over there among the mountains heaving their deadly charge over the side of the aeroplane? Strange hopes began to lift the tail of the Slavic fox again. What was the man saying? One must talk to him anyhow until one knew. At any moment the little brass door behind him might open with the news of Brissago blown to atoms. Then it would be a delightful relief to the present tension to arrest this chatter forthwith. He might be killed perhaps. What? The king was repeating his observation. They have a ridiculous fantasy that your confidence is based on the possession of atomic bombs. King Ferdinand Charles pulled himself together. He protested. "Oh, quite so," said the ex-king. "Quite so." "What grounds?" The ex-king permitted himself a gesture and the ghost of a chuckle. Why the devil should he chuckle? "Practically none," he said. "But of course with these things one has to be so careful." And then again, for an instant, something, like the faintest shadow of derision, gleamed out of the envoy's eyes and recalled that chilly feeling to the King Ferdinand's spine. Some kindred depression had come to Pestovitch, who had been watching the drawn intensity of Firmin's face. He came to the help of his master, who, he feared, might protest too much. "A search!" cried the king. "An embargo on our airplanes!" "Only a temporary expedient," said the ex-king Egbert, "while the search is going on." The king appealed to his council. "The people will never permit it, sire," said a bustling little man in a gorgeous uniform. "You'll have to make 'em," said the ex-king, genially addressing all the councilors. King Ferdinand glanced at the closed brass door, through which no news would come. "When would you want to have this search?" The ex-king was radiant. "We couldn't possibly do it until the day after tomorrow," he said. "Just the capital?" "Where else?" asked the ex-king, still more cheerfully. "For my own part," said the ex-king confidentially, "I think the whole business ridiculous. Who would be such a fool as to hide atomic bombs? Nobody. Certain hanging if he's caught. Certain. And almost certain blowing up if he isn't. But nowadays I have to take orders like the rest of the world, and here I am." The king thought he had never met such detestable geniality. He glanced at Pestovitch, who nodded almost imperceptibly. It was well, anyhow, to have a fool to deal with. They might have sent a diplomatist. "Of course," said the king, "I recognize the overpowering force, and a kind of logic, in these orders from Brissago." "I knew you would," said the ex-king, with an air of relief, "and so let us arrange." They arranged with a certain informality. No Balkan aeroplane was to adventure into the air until the search was concluded, and meanwhile the fleets of the world government would soar and circle in the sky. The towns were to be placarded with offers of reward to anyone who would help in the discovery of atomic bombs. "You will sign that," said the ex-king. "Why?" "To show that we aren't in any way hostile to you." Pestovitch nodded yes to his master. "And then, you see," said the ex-king in that easy way of his, "we'll have a lot of men here, borrow help from your police, and run through all your things. And then everything will be over. Meanwhile, if I may be your guest—" When presently Pestovitch was alone with the king again, he found him in a state of jangling emotions. His spirit was tossing like a wind-whipped sea. One moment he was exalted and full of contempt for "that ass" and his search. The next he was down in a pit of dread. "They will find them, Pestovitch, and then he'll hang us." "Hang us?" The king put his long nose into his counsellor's face. "That grinning brute wants to hang us," he said, "and hang us he will, if we give him a shadow of a chance." "But all their modern state civilization! Do you think there's any pity in that crew of godless, vivisecting prigs?" cried this last king of romance. "Do you think, Pestovitch, they understand anything of a high ambition or a splendid dream? Do you think that our gallant and sublime adventure has any appeal to them? Here am I, the last and greatest and most romantic of the Caesars. And do you think they will miss the chance of hanging me like a dog if they can, killing me like a rat in a hole? And that renegade, he who was once an anointed king. I hate that sort of eye that laughs and keeps hard," said the king. "I won't sit here and be caught like a fascinated rabbit," said the king in conclusion. "We must shift those bombs." "Risk it," said Pestovitch. "Leave them alone." "No," said the king. "Shift them near the frontier. Then while they watch us here, they will always watch us here now, we can buy an airplane abroad and pick them up." The king was in a feverish, irritable mood all that evening, but he made his plans nevertheless with infinite cunning. They must get the bombs away. There must be a couple of atomic hay lorries. The bombs could be hidden under the hay. Pestovitch went and came, instructing trusty servants, planning and replanning. The king and the ex-king talked very pleasantly of a number of subjects. All while at the back of King Ferdinand Charles's mind fretted the mystery of his vanished aeroplane. There came no news of its capture, and no news of its success. At any moment all that power at the back of his visitor might crumble away and vanish. It was past midnight when the king, in a cloak and slouch hat that might equally have served a small farmer, or any respectable middle-class man, slipped out from an inconspicuous service gate on the eastward side of his palace into the thickly wooded gardens that sloped in a series of terraces down to the town. Pestovitch and his guard valet Peter, both wrapped about in a similar disguise, came out among the laurels that bordered the pathway and joined them. It was a clear, warm night, but the stars seemed unusually little and remote because of the airplanes, each trailing a searchlight, that drove hither and thither across the blue. One great beam seemed to rest on the king for a moment as he came out of the palace, then instantly and reassuringly it had swept away. But while they were still in the palace gardens, another found them and looked at them. "They see us!" cried the king. "They make nothing of us," said Pestovitch. The king glanced up and met a calm, round eye of light that seemed to wink at him and vanish, leaving him blinded. The three men went on their way. Near the little gate in the garden railings that Pestovitch had caused to be unlocked, the king paused under the shadow of a flex and looked back at the place. It was very high and narrow, a 20th century rendering of medievalism in stone and bronze and sham stone and opaque glass. Against the sky it splashed a confusion of pinnacles. High up in the eastward wing were the windows of the apartments of the ex-King Egbert. One of them was brightly lit now, and against the light a little black figure stood very still and looked out upon the night. The king snarled. "He little knows how we slipped through his fingers," said Pestovitch. And as he spoke, they saw the ex-king stretch out his arms slowly, like one who yawns, knuckle his eyes, and turn inward, no doubt to his bed. Down through the ancient winding back streets of his capital hurried the king, and at an appointed corner a shabby atomic automobile waited for the three. It was a hackney carriage of the lowest grade, with dinted metal panels and deflated cushions. The driver was one of the ordinary drivers of the capital, but beside him sat the young secretary of Pestovitch, who knew the way to the farm where the bombs were hidden. The automobile made its way through the narrow streets of the old town, which were still lit and uneasy, for the fleet of airships overhead had kept the cafes open and people abroad, over the great new bridge, and so by straggling outskirts to the city. And all through his capital the king who hoped to outdo Caesar sat back and was very still, and no one spoke. And as they got out into the dark country, they became aware of the searchlights wandering over the countryside, like the uneasy ghosts of giants. The king sat forward and looked at these flittering whitenesses, and every now and then peered up to see the flying ships overhead. "I don't like them," said the king. Presently one of these patches of moonlight came to rest about them and seemed to be following their automobile. The king drew back. "The things are confoundedly noiseless," said the king. "It's like being stalked by lean white cats." He peered again. "That fellow is watching us," he said. And then suddenly he gave way to panic. "Pestovitch," he said, clutching his minister's arm, "they are watching us. I'm not going through with us. They are watching us. I'm going back." Pestovitch remonstrated. "Tell him to go back," said the king, and tried to open the window. For a few moments there was a grim struggle in the automobile, a gripping of wrists and a blow. "I can't go through with it," repeated the king. "I can't go through with it." "But they'll hang us," said Pestovitch. "Not if we were to give up now. Not if we were to surrender the bombs. It is you who brought me into this." At last Pestovitch compromised. There was an inn perhaps half a mile from the farm. They could alight there, and the king could get brandy, and rest his nerves for a time. And if he still thought fit to go back, he could go back. "See," said Pestovitch, "the light has gone on again." The king peered up. "I believe he's following us without a light," said the king. In the little old dirty inn, the king hung doubtful for a time, and was for going back and throwing himself on the mercy of the council. "If there is a council," said Pestovitch, "by this time your bombs may have settled it." "But if so, these infernal airplanes would go." "They may not know yet." "But, Pestovitch, why couldn't you do all this without me?" Pestovitch made no answer for a moment. "I was for leaving the bombs in their place," he said at last, and went to the window. About their conveyance shone a circle of bright light. Pestovitch had a brilliant idea. "I will send my secretary out to make a kind of dispute with the driver, something that will make them watch up above there. Meanwhile you and I and Peter will go out by the back way and up by the hedges to the farm." It was worthy of his subtle reputation, and it answered passing well. In 10 minutes they were tumbling over the wall of the farmyard, wet, muddy, and breathless, but unobserved. But as they ran toward the barns, the king gave vent to something between a groan and a curse, and all about them shone the light, and passed. But had it passed at once, or lingered for just a second? "They didn't see us," said Peter. "I don't think they saw us," said the king, and stared as the light went swooping up the mountainside, hung for a second about a hayrick, and then came pouring back. "In the barn!" cried the king. He bruised his shin against something, and then all 3 men were inside the huge steel-girdered barn, in which stood the 2 motor hay lorries that were to take the bombs away. Kurt and Abel, the 2 brothers of Peter, had brought the lorries thither in daylight. They had the upper half of the loads of hay thrown off, ready to cover the bombs, so soon as the king should show the hiding place. "There's a sort of pit here," said the king. "Don't light another lantern. This key of mine releases a ring." For a time scarcely a word was spoken in the darkness of the barn. There was a sound of a slab being lifted, and then of feet descending a ladder into a pit, then whispering, and then heavy breathing as Kurt came struggling up with the first of the hidden bombs. "We shall do it yet," said the king, and then he gasped, "Curse that light! Why in the name of heaven didn't we shut the barn door?" For the great door stood wide open and all the empty, lifeless yard outside, and the door and 6 feet of the floor of the barn were in the blue glare of an inquiring searchlight. "Shut the door, Peter," said Pestovitch. "No," cried the king, too late, as Peter went forward into the light. "Don't show yourself!" cried the king. Kurt made a step forward and plucked his brother back. For a time all 5 men stood still. It seemed that light would never go, and then abruptly it was turned off, leaving them blinded. "Now," said the king uneasily, "now shut the door." "Not completely," cried Pestovitch. "Leave a chink for us to go out by." It was hot work shifting those bombs, and the king worked for a time like a common man. Kurt and Abel carried the great things up, and Peter brought them to the carts, and the king and Pestovitch helped him to place them among the hay. They made as little noise as they could. "Shh!" cried the king. "What's that?" But Kurt and Abel did not hear, and came blundering up the ladder with the last of the load. "Shh!" Peter ran forward to them with a whispered remonstrance. Now they were still. The barn door opened a little wider, and against the dim blue light outside they saw the black shape of a man. "Anyone here?" he asked, speaking with an Italian accent. The king broke into a cold perspiration. Then Pestovitch answered. "Only a poor farmer loading hay," he said, and picked up a huge hay fork and went forward softly. "You load your hay at a very bad time and in a very bad light," said the man at the door, peering in. "Have you no electric light here?" Then suddenly he turned on an electric torch, and as he did so Pestovitch sprang forward. "Get out of my barn!" he cried, and drove the fork full at the intruder's chest. He had a vague idea that he might stab the man to silence. But the man shouted loudly as the prongs pierced him and drove him backward, and instantly there was a sound of feet running across the yard. "Bombs!" cried the man upon the ground, struggling with the prongs in his hand, and as Pestovitch staggered forward into view with the force of his own thrust, he was shot through the body by one of the 2 newcomers. The man on the ground was hurt badly, but plucky. "Bombs!" he repeated, and struggled up to a kneeling position, and held his electric torch full upon the face of the king. "Shoot them!" he cried, coughing and spitting blood. so that the halo of light round the king's head danced about. For a moment in that shivering circle of light the two men saw the king kneeling up in the cart, and Peter on the barn floor beside him. The old fox looked at them sideways, snared, a white-faced evil thing, and then, with a faltering suicidal heroism, he leant forward over the bomb before him. They fired together and shot him through the head. The upper part of his face seemed to vanish. "Shoot them!" cried the man who had been stabbed. "Shoot them all!" And then his light went out, and he rolled over with a groan at the feet of his comrades. But each carried a light of his own, and in another moment everything in the barn was visible again. They shot Peter even as he held up his hands in sign of surrender. Kurt and Abel, at the head of the ladder, hesitated for a moment, and then plunged backwards into the pit. "If we don't kill them," said one of the sharpshooters, "they'll blow us to rags. They've gone down that hatchway. Come!" "Here they are. Hands up, I say. Hold your light while I shoot." Section 8. It was still quite dark when his valet and Firmin came together and told the ex-king Egbert that the business was settled. He started up into a sitting position on the side of his bed. "Did he go out?" asked the ex-king. "He is dead," said Firmin. "He was shot." The ex-king reflected. "That's about the best thing that could have happened," he said. "Where are the bombs? In that farmhouse on the opposite hillside? Why, the place is in sight. Let us go. I'll dress. Is there any one in that place, Firmin, to get us a cup of coffee?" Through the hungry twilight of the dawn, the ex-king's automobile carried him to the farmhouse where the last rebel king was lying among his bombs. The rim of the sky flashed, the east grew bright, and the sun was just rising over the hills when King Egbert reached the farmyard. There he found the hay lorries drawn out from the barn, with the dreadful bombs still packed upon them. A couple of score of aviators held the yard, and outside a few peasants stood in a little group and stared, ignorant as yet of what had happened. Against the stone wall of the farmyard 5 bodies were lying neatly side to side, and Pestovitch had an expression of surprise on his face, and the king was chiefly identifiable by his long white hands and his blond mustache. The wounded aeronaut had been carried down to the inn, and after the ex-king had given directions in what manner the bombs were to be taken to the new special laboratories above Zurich, where they could be unpacked in an atmosphere of chlorine, he turned to those 5 still shapes. Their 5 pairs of feet stuck out with a curious stiff unanimity. "What else was there to do?" he said in answer to some internal protest. "I wonder, Firmin, if there are any more of them?" "Bombs, sir?" asked Firmin. "No, such kings." "The pitiful folly of it," said the ex-king, following his thoughts. "Firmin, as an ex-professor of international politics, I think it falls to you to bury them. There? No, don't put them near the well. People will have to drink from that well. Bury them over there, some way off in the field." End of chapter 3.